Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Learning Engineering Podcast. I'm Dr. Scotty Craig, your host for today. I'm being joined by one of my students, Robert Siegel.
Hello, everyone. Robert Siegel here, and we have a very special guest on today.
Yes, we do. We're actually joined by Dr. Sae Schatz, who I'm going to let introduce herself because she has actually done a lot, and she can do a much better justice of introducing herself than I ever could.
Hi, everybody. So as Scotty said, my name is Sae. I have had a pretty interesting journey to get here today. I most recently was working with the government in the Pentagon, running the Advanced Distributed Learning Program for the Department of Defense. And now I'm doing my own consulting work and talking about learning engineering, learning sciences, learning technologies across the world.
That is great, and I think we're going to have a really interesting conversation about that today. So how did you first kind of come to learning engineering as far as your focus training areas? So what is your actual training in?
So this is kind of a funny story. I think maybe like a lot of people, when I was 18 and I was deciding I was going to go to the university, I had a great decision-making process. I thought, well, first of all, I would like it to be someplace warm. And secondly, I would like to study liberal arts, so a variety of different things, not just one particular trade school. And it should be far away from my parents. So I ended up at the University of Central Florida, and I started studying art, classic art. And then I decided, I don't want to be a starving artist. I'm going to study graphic design, commercial art. And I thought, yeah, okay, that's good, but I don't want to be a starving graphic designer. And I'm very interested in web design and graphic design and game design. So let me also study computer science, because then I can do the back-end development and I can do the front-end design, and I think that'll work out really well. So I ended up getting a computer degree and almost finishing my art degree when I realized, wait, I already know how to do the art piece, so I don't really need the second degree. But let me go ahead and let me get an English master's degree now, because I'm already now working professionally at the university at the time. I was working professionally doing web design, the back end, the front end, and also the copy for the websites. And I was writing about the professor's research and, things like academic marketing, basically. I really enjoyed writing about the research that the faculty were doing for the website. So I decided I would go get my technical writing degree so I could do a better job of writing about the faculty's research. And along the process here, one of my professors, who eventually became my advisor, stopped me and he said, what are you doing here? You're really interested in computers. You're really interested in design and human-centered approaches to things. You like art and you like research. Why don't you go do your own research instead of writing about other people's research? And I said, that's a pretty good idea, but I'm pretty interdisciplinary. What is that? And he said, think about modeling and simulation. So I got into the modeling and simulation program, which, UCF is very well known for, and it was just a perfect fit. And so I ended up studying human systems and modeling and simulation, which is the idea of taking computers and modeling and data and focusing it around how people think or being able to interface with people, so human-computer interaction or even large-scale human systems integration at like a socio-technical organization. And I had a particular focus for training and education. So leveraging these advanced technologies for training and education with a background in art and with a background in design. And hopefully you see how this kind of leads me to learning engineering, because it's kind of a circuitous route, but I think it's actually perfect for where we need to be today.
Yeah, and I think that all of us had a kind of indirect route where we did other things and just found learning engineering. Do you remember, you've been talking about the learning engineering area for a while, do you remember when you first found out about it, or how you first found out about it?
I tried to remember how I first found out about it, and I'm really not sure. It may have been through some of the early seeds of Icicle and the learning engineering community, where I maybe first heard the term. I'm not 100% sure, but I can say the things that resonated with me when I first heard about learning engineering were its concept of the diversity of disciplines all coming together. I mean, I just told you about my background, right?
Yeah.
And so obviously, it's like I'm walking down the academic buffet and taking a little bit of everything and putting it on my plate. But it's not just a matter of putting it all on my plate. It's a matter of mixing it together. And I see that in learning engineering as well, right? It's not just these different disciplines adjacent to one another, but truly integrated with that emphasis on data, with that emphasis on human-centered design, with that emphasis on learning science, and then having DevOps like processes mixed into it, you know, that continuous integration to continuous deployment approach, that systems engineering approach. And so when I first heard about this methodology for approaching learning challenges, it just instantly resonated. Like, yeah, of course. Why aren't we all doing that? This is exactly the right way to do things.
Yeah, I agree. It's like it is kind of sometimes very hard to pinpoint like exactly when these things kind of grew kind of naturally. So as far as areas within learning engineering, I mean, the one thing, you know, we talked about like learning engineering is a process. And at the same time, we realized that we're all coming with specific skills to it. And I really like your idea of like, you know, your kind of the idea of a buffet. You're getting a little bit of this, a little bit of this. With learning engineering, we do tend to kind of mix a lot of these together. So if we're mixing our food, it's not individually compartmentalized. You know, thinking about like the areas that you have chosen to put onto your plate as far as training, what would you say those are?
Yeah, so I think I'm kind of unique in that sense that I bring the learning science, so deep understanding of pedagogy, andragogy, heutagogy, you know, if you want to win at Jeopardy and know what that specialty
Yes.
term, but that deep discipline as well as the different learning technologies, the understanding of software, understanding of advanced technologies like artificial intelligence, a data-driven approach to it, so the learning analytics piece, as well as human-centered design, both at an individual level, so like human factors, ergonomics, user experience design, but also at larger scale, so the integration of technologies into enterprises, thinking about organizational processes. And so I think I usually describe myself as sort of a jack of all trades, or I guess a Jill of all trades, sort of the mortar in between the bricks of the other disciplines. Not necessarily an expert compared to the experts who are deep within every single discipline, but that connector that brings them all together.
That's great. And that actually is a wonderful segue into our next kind of questions, talking about learning engineering projects that you've worked on. Is there any one specific learning engineering project that you would like to talk about?
Well, I think I'll cheat and I'll talk about two because they're
That's
they're
fine.
two sides of the same coin. And I would
It's often
say
the
that,
case.
yeah, exactly. So I think it's the work that I did, and you were a part of this. And when I was with the Advanced Distributed Learning Program, we published a book which has become really popular now called Modernizing Learning, Building the Future Learning Ecosystem. And it was one of the first books that really brought together all these different diverse disciplines on our academic buffet and tried to say, look, this is what we need to build, not just within an organization or an academic department, but across society. And how might we do this notion of a learning ecosystem where learning happens across our lives, across different platforms, across different technologies, but it's still coherent and it's effective. And that book has been incredibly popular. But we didn't just talk about it. We also put our money where our mouth was. In other words, we actually started to work towards building out those different learning technology standards, the different learning science methodologies, and then in practice in the Department of Defense, the true technologies to enable this. And that work, which is usually dubbed a learning ecosystem, I think is probably the most notable effort that I've been involved with. Now you might say, okay, well, where's the learning engineering piece? Because that sounds like a lot of learning technology. But I think that these both go together because learning engineers need the capabilities not just to deliver effective learning within a small silo, but to be able to think broadly and to have those tools in place to do so. And vice versa, the learning technologists or the people who are implementing data-driven learning at a large scale need to have specialists who understand learning sciences, organizational design, human-centered design, nudge, user experience, to be implementing those systems. And so I really see learning engineering and all these advanced learning technologies, in particular learning ecosystems, as necessarily going hand in hand.
No, I agree, and I think that's actually a very important point to pull that together. I also kind of want to point out that this book, it is, and again, I agree, it's a wonderful contribution, but it's also free.
That's right. Exactly. Yeah. People can just go, search for it online. And it's
Yeah.
also been translated in 3 or 4 other languages
Yes.
as well. So it's pretty cool.
I was about to ask you that. I was like, do you know how many languages have been translated into now? Every time I look, it seems like it has a new one.
Yeah, exactly. It's just fantastic. And I I really love that too about the learning engineering community. And I know that's not only the learning engineering community, but I really feel like this community comes together when it has to do with sharing knowledge, Creative Commons, or open sourcing, whether it be software or concepts. And I appreciate that. Get the knowledge out.
Yes. And just so the audience knows, we will put a link to the book in case you'd like it, along with this podcast. So if you just look below, you should find it.
And also, let's share out Learning Engineering infographic that Jim Goodell and I created, which also, by the way, has been translated into French thanks to the Canadian government.
Oh, that's great. I didn't actually know about that. That's great. We can actually we can link to that also. And we can also link to your new article actually that you and Jim just published in the Journal of Military Learning.
We are busy bees.
You are. I was very excited to get that for my special issue. We'll link to all three of those down below when we release this podcast. And also just as a personal thing to point out about the book for me, I was excited because not just the book was free, but I actually got to use it when teaching a class. So I actually taught a class using the book, and it actually worked really well for teaching the class. And Robert was actually our guest host, who has been quiet, was actually in that class. So he actually got to experience it. So it's been a lot of fun.
It was my first class as a graduate student. It was a wonderful introduction and really helped me get into the mindset, especially of being interdisciplinary, which, as you've hit on, is incredibly vital to being a good learning engineer.
I think that's the theme of this podcast is interdisciplinariness. I think that's a word.
You can make them up.
One of the things I always say to people about learning engineering is it's different from what we do typically in an instructional technology context, where we tend to have the instructional designers create the curriculum, and then they pass that over to, let's say, the curriculum or the courseware developers, over in their basement room somewhere without the windows, right? And they type in the courseware into the technology, and then they hand it off to maybe the psychometrician who makes a test, and then they hand it off to the instructor. And while, yes, there are diversity of disciplines involved with that more assembly line-like process, it is not the same as the intent of learning engineering, where you bring all those folks together in the same room, have them working towards the same goal, not just individual pieces in a process, which will never get you to that same big picture outcome, as if people are truly bringing their creativity and innovation together towards that shared outcome. So that's a big difference between learning engineering and like a typical instructional design approach to a technology-enabled learning piece.
Just to give our audience a good idea of like the breadth of disciplines that you've worked with or that learning engineers could interact with, like in one room that you've ever been on for a project, how many different disciplines, like what kind of fields have you, have you led?
I mean,
that's a dangerous question.
Easily dozens. I mean, lots and lots of different disciplines. And in particular, because like I said, not only were we working on like individual projects like related to, let's say, a course or a department, but we were doing enterprise level, Department of Defense enterprise level efforts. And so, you're bringing together people from obviously learning sciences, classic instructional design, which is a little bit different in some cases, subject matter experts, obviously, measurement experts, ethics experts, of course, technologists, software developers, cloud developers, cybersecurity specialists, data specialists, analytics specialists, not necessarily the same as like a data engineer. Data engineers building out the infrastructure. The data scientists are analyzing the pieces. So those are all different people. You need policy experts involved. You need people who are experts at building out competencies, which is not the same as learning science or subject matter expertise. Yep. So you're bringing all of these folks together, and there's a lot of voices at the table. So it can be a more challenging approach sometimes, but at the same time, you're going to get to a better outcome that's going to be longer lasting. So I guess the answer to that question was lots.
Yeah,
No,
they're
I
often,
appreciate that.
yeah, I would say that it's often a very large and crowded table, and that's what makes it kind of fun. So you actually, as we've already touched on, like, you have a very broad area of training and a lot of experience. I mean, you talked about the book, which is just one project. I mean, we could go on to project after project after project, I think. Thinking about like all the different learning engineering type projects you had, can you think of any general kind of lessons or lessons learned from either this project and your other projects that you think would be useful for people to know?
Yeah, I have a few recommendations. So the first one, and this probably is not surprising given what I just said about having a lot of stakeholders involved, it's imperative but also challenging to get organizational buy-in for the integrated, iterative, continuous approach that learning engineering recommends. And this is true also for software engineering or any kind of product-focused effort. We really need to have integrated teams that are iterating through agile methods. We know that's the best way to do things, but also we tend to know that project managers want to do more of a waterfall approach. They want to do a one and done sort of thing. So really emphasizing that organizational buy-in for the iterative, incremental, and integrated approach up front is essential. Number two, we tend to, and I don't necessarily mean the people listening to this podcast, but a lot of times organizations tend to have bad habits when it comes to data. One of them tends to be that people love to measure things that are easy to measure but actually have no relevance. Vanity metrics. How long somebody spent in a classroom. I measured 50,000 clicks from the students in this course. Great. They clicked 50,000 times? Like, what does that mean? So we tend to collect things that don't matter as much. And even if we do collect things that actually have some meaningful value, a lot of times we'll just sit on them. I like to say that this is the dragon problem, where we're like a dragon sitting on our hoard of gold, except in this case, it's our hoard of data. And we're so proud. Look, I have 50,000 XAPI statements. Okay, cool. But like, what are we doing with them? So we always need to make sure that we're making decisions with the data that we're collecting, and that we're thinking about the return on investment of the time and energy necessary to collect and analyze data. If we're not actually using those data to some meaningful end, then why are we collecting them? And then number three, I would say that the third big thing that I often see is that we undervalue and either tack on to the end or just don't even include user experience design. I don't just mean human-centered design. Like, yes, obviously we need to do human-centered design. But we also need to think about usability. We need to think about things like nudge and aesthetics and all of the pieces that actually make it easy for people to use the technology. And that technology could be a book, right? It could be an infographic. It doesn't have to be like some sort of like high-end AI-driven game or virtual reality, but like anything that we're creating, we really need to think about that user experience throughout from the beginning and then iteratively as we refine how it's used.
Thank you for those, especially that third point. It was actually so important because I think that, again, just think about the area of learning technology. Like, we've built a lot of great systems that are supported by a lot of great learning science, a lot of great computer science that have skipped that design science piece and have gone nowhere.
Absolutely. And if nobody can see your amazingly designed curriculum or your fantastic virtual reality game because they're so frustrated with the load screen that they can't reach it, then it doesn't matter how much time and energy you put into it. I used to fight when I was in grad school. I used to argue with my professor about how much design mattered. And he would say, you know, we just need to have ergonomics. Like, you just need human factors. Things don't actually have to be a good user experience. They just need to be usable. Then Don Norman came out with his book, Emotional Design.
Yes.
And, you know, it's a great book, by the way, if you haven't read it. And it talks about the power of aesthetics and of actually having like a joyful experience. And research studies that have shown, for example, that pretty things work better. In other words, things, let's say software interfaces that people feel are aesthetically pleasing, they actually are able to better problem solve and better use those systems because, you know, they're interacting with them more naturally. And the research actually supports the idea that aesthetics is not just a emotional connection, not just something that we enjoy, but actually improves the performance. So pretty things work better. Don't forget about user experience. Don't forget about aesthetics.
And I think that's actually, just from the researcher in me coming out, I mean, that's a huge area that needs more research, because especially in the educational technology areas, I think it's ripe for new research. So if any students are actually thinking about master's or dissertation ideas, maybe you should think about that. Might be an interesting area. Not encouraging you to change your dissertation topic, Robert.
Well, I would like to ask, though, with getting organizations to buy in to the long-term needs of learning engineering and to avoid these pitfalls with data and to value the user experience, how do you go about approaching an organization and discussing this with them? Or is this more something where they come to you?
Well, I think it's going to be very idiosyncratic. And the question is, what does that organization care about? Do they care about, for example, learning outcomes? For instance, if it's something like the Department of Defense, or maybe something like first responders, medical professionals, pilots, they actually really care about the outcomes. They want to make sure that their folks are trained, are effectively educated, and that they can depend on it. Then we can rely upon the data that says, if we take these iterative approaches, if we use learning engineering methodologies, we are going to more assuredly get to the kinds of learning outcomes we want. Cool, great. But then other organizations, that might not be the thing that actually drives them. Other organizations might be more interested in the bottom line. How can I quickly get my people up to a good enough level so that I can outperform the competition? Okay, great. Then we start to look at some of the research related to the efficiency of learning and about how if we tailor and personalize learning, we can get to those outcomes more rapidly. So it really depends on who you're talking to. Although I would say one thing, because we're all probably nerds listening to this, because you're listening to a podcast about learning engineering, we probably are going to be more likely to resonate with research-based arguments. But remember, a lot of people don't. And so turn that same sort of user experience approach that we want to take towards education and training and put that towards your arguments when you discuss with leadership or other stakeholders what it is you're doing. Sometimes you need to apply user experience design, nudge, and behavioral economics principles to how you're talking to leadership.
Let's move on now to our final topic, which is this one's actually pretty open for you. As far as anything that you would like to add, promote, anything that you feel like has been left out that we need to add to this that you want to get out to the audience?
I would just say that what I'm working on now, I'll talk a little bit about kind of what I am excited about and what I'm working on now. I'm working on 2 books with my colleagues Julian Stodd and Jeff Stead. The first is a curious book about generative AI. So really thinking about how generative AI and this new wave of machine learning enabled capabilities are going to affect not only how we learn, but how we all live. And then I'm also working on a second book with them related to learning science. And I've been both excited and a little surprised that folks who work with learning, even directly, let alone tangentially, really could benefit from knowing more about some of these fundamental principles and how we can integrate them into real practical systems outside of just an academic context. And so that second book will bridging that gap between the science of learning in a true classic academic sense and then the practice of implementing it. So those are the big things I'm working on. In addition to that, I'm doing a lot of speaking, a lot of writing, and different workshops. So if someone who's listening out there is interested in talking to me about any of these topics or having me talk to people at your school or your organization about some of these concepts, please find me on LinkedIn or just bother Scotty and he can track me down.
It's true, but that's great. That's actually really exciting. I'm actually excited about those 2 books because Gen AI is really important right now. I know from coming from academia, for the last year, it's all anybody has talked about. And interesting because we've been working through a lot of the fear around Gen AI. It's going to take over. Students are just going to use it to cheat. Students are going to basically get content from it.
So I think it's interesting that you said cheat.
Yes.
And I don't know if that's your feeling or if you're just repeating what other people have said.
I'm repeating what other people said. Yeah, I've been fighting against these points.
It's like, hey, this is like the new world. Like,
yes.
Yeah, it's like, what is the cheating, right? Of course, we've all heard
Yeah.
the famous quote from Socrates now that's been bandied about, right? About him complaining about the advent of writing
Yes.
being the cheat for the academic back then, and
Yes.
making learners no longer capable of thinking or remembering, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's really interesting how we've all reacted to it. So yeah, that's what that book will address, not just within a learning context, although certainly within learning as well.
And there's also a lot of fear about like replacement with Gen AI also.
Yeah.
I've even heard like, people are academics are afraid like, oh yeah, administrators are going to replace them because they can just have Gen AI create videos for content. And they'll
well, if we go back to the vanity metrics that we talked about before,
Yes.
If you are measuring the quality of your job by how many minutes of video you posted onto your e-learning platform,
Yes.
then generative AI may threaten you. But if you are measuring the quality of your work based upon more important outcomes, more value
Yes.
that you're building, then I think that you're just going to find that generative AI makes your job easier.
Yeah. And that's why I'm excited, about the books. I think it will help to mitigate a lot of these concerns. Because I agree, like, I won't say they're not valid fears. They're fears that people have, so they are valid for them. But I don't think they're as big of a worry. They're more of an initial reaction. As you educate people, as people get more comfortable with generative AI, they will actually start to see the usefulness for it. But yeah, we've been dealing with that so much over the last year. And I'm also happy to hear about you moving and starting to look at that kind of the research practice gap within the science of learning. We've known about it. We've talked about that for a decade, probably 2 decades, maybe 3 decades, but it's still there. So I wish you luck in that book also in helping to bridge that gap because it's not easy.
Yeah, we made a big concept map, of course, very beautifully designed. We've already talked about that. It's made a beautifully designed concept map, huge. It's 6 by 4 feet, and it spans the domain of learning science, and it's so complex. And then, it's not a surprise that it's challenging to apply this huge mass of knowledge in practice, but I think we're going to try to take a bite out of that apple.
That will be really interesting to see. I'm excited to hear I'm excited for these to come out, and I'm excited to be able to read them. When do you expect the books to come? Do you have a date yet?
Yeah,
or?
So we'll have the generative AI book out hopefully later this summer, summer of 2023, and then the learning science book out later this year, probably closer to winter.
I'd like to, we're at the end of our time, unfortunately. We could go on for hours and hours. I could probably fill a full podcast like series just talking with you, Sae. But I want to thank you for talking with us today. It's been a wonderful conversation, and thank you so much. I really do appreciate you coming on.
I appreciate you having
today.
me here, and I appreciate people listening and joining into the learning engineering field.